For those of you who have now joined us, thank you. We are expecting a very full virtual auditorium this afternoon. The webinar should begin at 3 p.m. or perhaps just a few minutes after. We're hoping to get most of the audience ready to listen by 3 o'clock. But be patient, take a stretch, make sure you have a glass of water, get comfortable. While you're waiting, there's two important things to do. One is to make sure your audio is working for you. If you can hear my voice, that's great. If you need to adjust the audio on your device, this would be a good time to do that. The other thing to look for, either on the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on how your device is set up, is something that says Q&A for questions and answers. All of the questions for our speaker today will be entered by typing in the Q&A box. So you click on that, it will open up to allow you to type a question. You can enter that question at any time during today's presentation, but we will save all of the questions until the completion of Wayne's prepared remarks, which should run about an hour, we're expecting, maybe slightly under. So as I said, we'll be starting the program at about 3 or possibly a couple of minutes after. Welcome to all of those who have now entered our virtual auditorium this afternoon. Thank you. The webinar should start at 3 p.m. or perhaps just a couple of minutes after. We're expecting a very large audience today. We're hoping to have most of them on board before we begin, but we won't delay much past a couple of minutes after 3. While you're waiting, please make yourself comfortable and also do two things. Make sure that your audio is working well for you. If you can hear my voice, that's great. You should be all set. If you need to make adjustments on your device, this would be a good time to do that. The other thing to look for is the Q&A button, either on the top or bottom of your screen. That is the place to enter questions, which you can do at any time during today's program. We will save all of the questions to respond to at the end of Wayne's prepared remarks, but just get familiar with where that Q&A button is so you can click on it and type in your question at any time. We'll be back with you just before the program is going to begin. We're just approaching the top of the hour. There's still quite a bit of the audience who have not yet arrived. We're going to give them a couple of minutes. So be comfortable. Make sure your volume is working well for you. If you just arrived, as I've told others in the audience, please check to see that you can find the Q&A button for questions and answers so that at any time during the program, you can enter a question, which we will answer at the end of prepared remarks today. For those of you who have just joined, we'll be starting in just a minute. Get comfortable, check your volume, find where the Q&A button is so you'll be prepared to enter a question at any time. We will save all of the questions until the end of prepared remarks today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eileen McIntyre, and we're going to get started. For those of you who have just joined us, I know this is a reminder to everyone else, 2 things to check right now. Make sure your audio is sufficient for you to hear. If you can hear my voice, you should be all set, but otherwise make adjustments on your device. And the other thing is to check where the Q&A button is, either top or bottom of your screen. That's where you can enter questions at any time during this program, and we will save all of the questions until the end. We hope to get to almost all of them, but we'll do our best. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Paula Bagger for the Hingham Historical Society.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Hingham Historical Society, I'm pleased to welcome you to the third live via Zoom lecture in our 2020-2021 lecture series, Benjamin Lincoln's World. I'm sitting here in what was once called the Great Room of the House, built as part of the 1720s enlargement of the house by the general's father. More recently and prosaically, though, it's been known as the dining room. I'm pleased to report that our efforts to purchase and endow this house are proceeding, and we expect to be able to close on our acquisition before the end of the year. Thanks again to everyone for your support in this effort. This series is titled Benjamin Lincoln's World: Stories from Colonial Hingham to the Early Republic. Our topic today is the role of Hingham and New England slavery in the triangle trade. The Hingham Historical Society has a long tradition of supporting its members and members of our Hingham community in conducting their own research into important historical topics. Today's speaker, Wayne Eckerson, represents that long tradition, and his topic is one part of a current important research and study focus for the Society: the history of people of color in Hingham, whose experiences and concerns have long been excluded or only partially represented in our town history. Wayne Eckerson is a 30-year resident of Hingham and Hull and the president of the Eckerson Group, a research and consulting firm specializing in data analytics. He has a BA from Williams College in American Studies and an MA from Wesleyn University in Liberal Studies. Earlier in his career, he was a teacher of American and European history at the Rivers School. Here in Hingham, Wayne has served as president of the Hingham High School Cross Country and Track Booster Club, coached Hingham Youth Lacrosse, and served on the vestry of the parish of St. John the Evangelist, running its church school for a number of years. He is married to Christine, a well-known local artist, and is father to Olivia and Henry, both proud Hingham High School graduates. Before I turn the virtual lectern over to Wayne Eckerson, just a couple of pointers. Because today's program is being presented in Zoom's webinar format to provide you the best video and audio quality, all audience members will be muted throughout the program. And as Eileen has said a few times, to submit a question at any time, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be held until the conclusion of the lecture, which we expect to run about an hour. We'll then answer as many questions as time allows. We expect that today's program will conclude around 4:30 p.m. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Wayne Eckerson.
Thank you, Paula. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Hingham Historical Society for giving me the opportunity to speak on such an important and illuminating topic, and one that has gained great urgency given the recent events in our country. I'd also like to thank Eileen McIntyre for shepherding me through this entire process. I'd also like to thank Eileen, as well as Ellen Miller and Paula, for reviewing my content and clarifying many details, especially regarding people of color in Hingham. For those of you not familiar with Hingham, and I think there's a few on the line that aren't, it's a coastal community 12 miles south of Boston with a rich historical legacy. It was one of the first settlements in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and was incorporated in 1635. With its natural resources and proximity to Boston, Hingham quickly prospered. It has a rich architectural legacy with original colonial, Georgian, and federal style homes built by local merchants, ship captains, and shipbuilders. Our old ship church on Main Street is the only surviving 17th century Puritan meeting house in the country and the oldest continuously running church in America. As you can tell, Hingham has a lot of history, and I'm glad to share one lesser known part of that history with you today. But before we start, let's warm up your history muscles with a short quiz. Just a couple of questions. First, when did the first enslaved Africans arrive in New England? 1638, 1678, 1708, or 1728? Well, you might be surprised to know the answer is 1638. Not even a decade after the founding of the Mass Bay Colony, a merchant from Salem, Massachusetts returned from the West Indies with a number of trade items, including a handful of enslaved people. The merchant eventually sold 3 of those enslaved Africans to an Anglican named Samuel Maverick, who settled across the harbor from Boston on Noddle's Island, which is now part of East Boston near the airport. According to firsthand accounts, Maverick tried to breed his enslaved Africans, much to the distress of the female in the group. So morally, the Mass Bay Colony got off to an ignominious start despite its religious contours. You might find it interesting that the Maverick neighborhood in East Boston and the Maverick Blue Line T-stop are named after this very same Samuel Maverick. Given his involvement in slavery, maybe that's something East Boston should reconsider. So contrary to popular opinion, slavery started early in New England, but as you can see, it didn't really crescendo until the mid-18th century. In 1700, there were 1,500 enslaved people in New England, many of whom were Indians. That number grew to 16,000 by 1775. Hingham, given its rich natural resources and economy, played an active role in the slave trade, as we will see. By 1674, Hingham had 77 enslaved people, or 3% of its total population, and that was higher than New England average of 2.2%. So that's interesting, and we'll explore that as we dive into this lecture. Now, these numbers and percentages pale by what happened in the South eventually, with 34% of the population being enslaved. Given these percentages, it's not surprising that we are still dealing with the legacy of slavery in America. All right, second question. True or false? New England did not participate in the slave trade. Well, you probably know, hopefully know, the answer is false. The unfortunate fact is that New England ran the slave trade. It was the engine of the slave trade. Slavery would not have existed without New England. The 2 biggest slave trading ports were Boston and Newport. And according to Wendy Warren, historian of this period, by 1680s, more than half the ships in Boston Harbor were involved in West Indian trade, and almost half the boats trading in West Indies had set sail from New England ports. Newport was the biggest slave trading port in New England. Its merchants sponsored almost 1,000 slave trading voyages in the 18th century and shipped more than 100,000 Africans to the West Indies. Almost 20% of Newport's population consisted of enslaved or free slaves. Other New England slave trading ports included Salem, Newburyport, Providence, Bristol, and Portsmouth. Question 3. Which American colony first legalized slavery? Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Georgia. Well, you might also be surprised to know the answer is Massachusetts. Believe it or not, Massachusetts legalized slavery in 1641 in its first legal code, ironically named the Body of Liberties. Although it appears to outlaw slavery, as you can see here by this sentence, there shall be never any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless, and that unless is a big operative word here, unless there were just wars or commercial trades, which essentially made slavery almost universally legal. The Puritans would soon use the excuse of just wars to enslave thousands of Indian captives and send them to the West Indies, where they faced a slow but inexorable death. All right, last question. Which was the first New England state to entirely abolish slavery? Well, Massachusetts made up for its early misdeeds, you could say, by becoming the first New England state to entirely abolish slavery in 1783. Interestingly, it did this through a court ruling rather than an act of legislation, as we'll discuss later. All right, so let's now dive into the origins of slavery in New England. For me, this is a real head scratcher because slavery did not exist in England, where most of the early settlers of New England came from. So ultimately, this origin story is a multifaceted one. First, it's a story about English people who had no experience with slavery in their homeland, but embraced it with gusto in their adopted country. Second, it's a story about Puritans, a God-fearing English people who wanted to create God's kingdom on earth, a shining city on a hill, if you will. But in their pursuit of profit, they built it on the backs of enslaved people. Finally, it's a story about human nature. We humans have the uncanny and perhaps unfortunate ability to justify and rationalize reprehensible acts in the pursuit of our self-interest or emotional discharge. And this is not a historic phenomenon. Unfortunately, we see this behavior play out all the time and recently on our nightly news with alarming regularity. So slavery in New England starts with the Puritans. After King Charles I dissolved Parliament, raised taxes, and hounded Puritans and Catholics alike for their religious beliefs, tens of thousands of Puritans migrated to the New World during the 1630s. More than 20,000 came to New England, and another 20,000 went to the West Indies, which becomes a key element in our story. Besides fleeing religious persecution, the Puritans were lured by accounts of early English explorers who gushed about the rich and fertile lands and waters of the New World. The reality, however, as you can see here from this list, is that almost all of the early English settlements in New England failed due to climate, disease, starvation, and hostile natives. One of the biggest challenges facing the early settlers was that the land was already occupied by more than 60,000 Native Americans. There were numerous tribes with vibrant customs, language, and economies. The natives established trading relationships with the English settlers, but quickly fell prey to English diseases like smallpox, to which they had no immunity. Oops. The English explorer John Smith, who had visited native tribes in 1614 and returned in 1622, wrote, "God had laid this country open for us. Where I had once seen 100 or 200 people, there are scarce 10 to be found." The plague of 1616, which decimated coastal Indian tribes, created vacant lands that enabled the English, including the Hingham settlers, to get an important early foothold in the New World. So once settled, the Puritans faced four major economic challenges: land, labor, currency, and profit. So let's go through each of these quickly. Despite vacant Indian lands, there was not enough land to support tens of thousands of new settlers. After a generation, the proprietors of most Puritan towns, including Hingham, divided much of their common land amongst themselves, creating an early land-based gentry. Those who didn't win this lottery left in search of opportunities elsewhere. Second, labor. A big challenge facing the early settlers was lack of labor to do all the work required to establish and run a settlement, as you can imagine. Many brought indentured servants with them. Among Hingham's 130 original settlers, 30 were indentured servants. But these servants were expensive and departed soon after their tenure ended. To compensate, most settlers had big families averaging 8 children. But these large families later increased land pressure even more. Currency. Early settlers were desperately short of hard currency to buy manufactured goods needed to run a farm, raise livestock, and furnish a household. Early Hingham settlers sold timber, planks, and livestock to newer arrivals in exchange for silver, creating a Ponzi-like economy that depended on a perpetual influx of new settlers. And finally, early settlers wanted to rebuild their middle-class English life in the New World. This required a cash crop that they could sell for money, but none existed in New England unless you count the rocks. Hingham settlers, fortunately, had some advantages. There were many precious resources in Hingham. Foremost among them were the large pine trees on Mast Hill that could be turned into masts, planks, and boards for the early settlers. Those trees gave some early Hingham settlers enough money to buy land, set up mills, build ships, and begin trading with Boston and beyond. So to all four of those challenges, slavery was the answer. The slave trade generated huge profits and badly needed currency. New Englanders provided ships and barrels to transport people and goods. Enslaved people provided cheap labor and a market for New England livestock, fish, and agricultural products. And the slave trade provided a market for Indian captives whose land the English desperately wanted. Now, the first enslaved people in New England were not Africans, but Native Americans. The Puritans fought two wars, the Pequot War from 1636 to 1638 and King Philip's War from 1675 to 1676, during which thousands of Indians were killed or sold into slavery. But these conflicts were more than just settling disputes. They provided the colony with new lands and a supply of cheap labor. Emmanuel Downing, the brother-in-law of John Winthrop and the first benefactor of Harvard College, in 1645 wrote his brother-in-law, governor of Massachusetts Bay, quote, "If upon a just war," remember, just war, "the Lord should deliver the Indians into our hands, we might easily have men and women and children enough to exchange for wars, which will be more gainful pillage for than we conceive. For I do not see how we can thrive until we get into a stock of slaves sufficient to do all our business. You know very well that we shall maintain 20 Moors cheaper than one English servant." So the die was cast very early on for slavery in this pious Puritan colony. Now, things were going dandy for the Mass Bay colony in the 1630s, but all that came to a screeching halt in 1641 when the English Civil War broke out between the Puritan-led Parliament and King Charles I. The Civil War ended the Great Puritan Migration, and many settlers in New England decided to return home and join the fight. In the 1640s, Hingham's population actually declined from 700 to 400, some portion of which can be attributed to this reverse migration. Now, this reverse migration caused New England's economy to nearly collapse. Without new migrants, the new settlers had no one to purchase their livestock, timber, and agricultural goods, and no money to purchase new manufacturing and home goods. This fragile Ponzi-like economy was about to crash. Things were getting desperate. But then the Puritans found salvation in an unlikely place, a little island in the West Indies known as Barbados, where sugar production had just started to take off. And these Puritans were well positioned to take advantage of this new opportunity, since they had close ties with many Puritans who were already there and had migrated there during the 1630s. Sugar, finally, was the cash crop that the settlers, the investors in these trading companies, and merchants had long sought. The British colonists called it white gold because it was in such high demand throughout England and Europe. Consequently, planters planted every available acre on the island with sugarcane, leaving no room to grow their own food. That left a huge opening for industrious New Englanders to sell their surplus livestock, timber, and agricultural supplies. It was a match made, I don't know, in heaven, but somewhere else, perhaps. So sugar and the enslaved people who harvested seemed like manna from heaven to the early Puritans. John Winthrop, governor of Mass Bay Colony, wrote later in life about this pivotal period. He said, quote, "It pleased the Lord to open to us a trade with Barbados and other islands in the West Indies, which proved gainful. So the commodities we had in exchange there for our cattle and provisions, as sugar, cotton, tobacco, and indigo, were a good help to discharge our engagements in England." So thanks to the West Indies, New England trade blossomed, extending well beyond the carrying trade that existed between England and its colonies, where ships carried people and manufactured goods to the New World and returned with New England resources, fur, lumber, fish, wool, and whale oil primarily. Then when the West Indian trade opened up, New England ships brought livestock, lumber, fish, and enslaved Native Americans to the islands in exchange for molasses, hemp, indigo, cotton, and letters of credit, which they could transfer or exchange for actual currency in London, and a few African slaves. The New Englanders took molasses, which is a sugar byproduct, and turned it into rum, which they sold domestically and exported to Europe. They also used hemp for rope making, which was an early industry in Hingham. Things really picked up once New England merchants realized they could ship their rum to the west coast of Africa and trade it there for enslaved people. They took those folks to the West Indies where they traded them for molasses. They repeated this cycle time and time again, hundreds of times, literally, and it became known as the triangular trade. So here's an example of one voyage in that triangular trade. The ship in 1752, the ship Sanderson sailed from Newport, Rhode Island to the west coast of Africa with rum and African iron, which was a local currency. There it traded for 56 slaves, 40 ounces of gold, and 900 pounds of pepper. It then sailed to Barbados, where it sold the slaves and those goods. And with those proceeds, it purchased 55 barrels of molasses, 27 barrels of sugar, and bills of exchange worth 412 English sterling pounds. So New England merchants became extremely rich from this trade when it succeeded. There were a lot of risks, pirates, hurricanes, and other kinds of disasters. But when it worked, they became extremely wealthy. And with their profits, they built impressive colonial and federal style homes where they lived and purchased enslaved people to serve as household servants and laborers for themselves. Now, most of you have heard about the barbarity of slavery and the slave trade. The harsh reality is that life expectancy for an enslaved person in the West Indies was just 5 years. With such high death rates, plantation owners had to continually replenish their stock of enslaved people to operate their plantations, which meant this slave trade kept going on and on and on for decades, more than decades, centuries. The Reverend Morgan Godwin, an Anglican minister who served in both Virginia and Barbados, comments on the barbarity of the slaveholders. He writes, quote, "Their frequent emasculating, amputation of legs, cropping off of ears and heads too, and scant allowance for food and clothes, and often no less working than starving them to death, and their unmerciful correction of them." More brutal than the practice of slavery was the Middle Passage, quote unquote, from Africa to the West Indies, where it's estimated 20 to 30% of the enslaved people died en route, and many committed suicide by jumping overboard. Conditions were so bad that the white crew often fell prey to disease as well, which they called the White Death. And in a twist of irony, ship captains of these slave ships enlisted free slaves as crew, since those enslaved people were immune from the diseases that were rampant upon these ships. The majority of the enslaved Africans ended up in the West Indies working on the sugar plantations, but a few made their way to New England, usually the young or elderly or infirm that the plantation owners didn't want. They pretty much wanted able-bodied males. So these people were often referred to as remainders. Those are the ones who came to New England in twos or threes generally. Occasionally, rich merchants or ship captains made special orders, such as this 1930 request from Peter Faneuil, the richest merchant in Boston, who owned a slave trading ship called the Jolly Bachelor. He writes to his ship's captain, quote, "Bring me, for the use of my house, a straight-limbed Negro lad about the age of 12 to 15 years and of a tractable disposition." There is now a movement, recent movement, to change the name of Faneuil Hall in Boston due to Peter Faneuil's involvement in the slave trade. New England quickly became dependent on a slave-based economy, as you can see by the number of professions associated with the slave trade listed here. Historian Jared Ross Hardesty writes, as much as 40% of the economic activity in New England derived from West Indies sugar production. It's quite amazing. And historian Wendy Warren writes, New England in many ways depended on plantation slavery. Those plantations were simply offshore. As the 17th century went on, Puritans focused as much on profits as piety, as you can see. Consequently, Boston, Newport, and other merchant towns grew very rich and independent, causing concern to the British authorities and sowing the seeds for American independence a century later. Now, Hingham profited handsomely from the slave economy. Much of this stemmed from its coastal location and rich natural resources. Early settlers considered Hingham, quote, a promised land, a gift of divine providence of incredible natural resources, pure water in the town brook and the Weir River, a protected harbor, abundant wildlife, fish, crustaceans, game birds and beasts, wild fruit, sufficient annual rainfall, great stands of woodland, thousands of acres of natural grass for haying, substantial areas of open from the Indians, tillable land in recent Indian cultivation. Hingham exports to the West Indies included lumber, livestock, fish, and grain. Our industries grew up around this. Shipbuilding became an important industry for Hingham, lots of mills, and then coopers building barrels, hoops, staves, and eventually buckets, which gave us the name of Bucket Town. Hingham also had its own merchants. The leading one was Elisha Levitt, nicknamed Old Punk. Rhode Island played a huge role in the slave economy. Besides its merchants and ship captains, Newport had 13 rum distilleries. More than 30% of residents owned slaves, and many others purchased shares in slaving voyages. Everyone wanted to get rich, it seems. Besides rum distilleries, Newport merchants shipped large amounts of livestock and agricultural products from nearby farms in Narragansett County, pictured in orange here. Now called Washington County, this region was the closest thing New England had to a plantation economy. Whereas Hingham settlers were given a 5-acre house lot and 20 to 30 acres of tillable land, plus pasture land and a woodlot, the farms in Narragansett County were thousands of acres, and each had between 5 to 40 enslaved people working there, as well as indentured servants and hired labor. Smith's Castle in Wickford, Rhode Island, is an early plantation house and now a National Historic Landmark and House Museum, which you can visit. And you may have seen in the news this month that Rhode Islanders voted to change the name of their state from Rhode Island and Providence Plantations to simply Rhode Island. This change eliminates reference to Rhode Island's past slave-based economy, which I've just described. So that's the origins of slavery in a nutshell in New England. Let's now take a look at the people who purchased enslaved folks. Who were they? Why did they purchase them? What did they think of these enslaved people? And how did they treat them? And how did they actually justify this practice? So merchants were the first New Englanders to own enslaved people. They had money and connections to the West Indies and often owned the ships that transported them there. The merchants used females as household servants and males as butlers, carriage drivers, and escorts. In fact, they often dressed the male servants in the latest European fashions, turning them into status symbols of their wealth and worldly connections. Examples of Hingham merchants are Elisha Levitt, I just mentioned, Samuel Thaxter, and George Lane. Surprisingly, ministers also owned enslaved people, sometimes lots of them. Ministers had connections in urban areas where they received ecclesiastical training and traveled in the same social circles as merchants. Hingham's Hingham's longtime minister of the First Parish Church, Ebenezer Gay, owned a slave, and likely Reverend Daniel Shute, pastor of the Second Parish. Farmers also purchased slaves to help in the fields and manage livestock, especially in southern Rhode Island and Connecticut, the Connecticut River Valley, where there were large farms. Some enslaved people were highly respected husbandmen and farmers and commanded a high price if hired out by their owners. Here are some of Hingham's farmers who owned enslaved people: John Jacob, Theophilus Cushing, and John Baxter. Tradesmen also owned enslaved people to assist in their shops. It was, in fact, very common to see enslaved people working for shipbuilders, distilleries, tree cutters, but also in specialty trades such as printing, gold and silversmithing, and clockmaking. Some enslaved people became highly respected artisans. And here are some Hingham slaveholders who were tradesmen: Francis Barker, a shipwright; Thomas Lawrence Sadler; and James Hersey, a cordwainer. So here's an interesting statistic. By the mid-18th century, 1750s, farmers and tradesmen owned more slaves than merchants. Slavery had become commonplace in the 18th century. Most homes in Boston and Newburyport had an enslaved person. In fact, even before then, slavery had become commonplace, especially in urban coastal ports. This is a comment from a European traveler visiting Boston in 1687. He writes, "You may also own Negroes and Negresses in New England, for there is not a house in Boston, however small may be its means, there is not one or two." So what did slave holders think of enslaved people living in their midst? First, they thought of them and called them strangers. They had different skin, hair, language, religion, and customs, such as the practice of polygamy. For most settlers, the enslaved would never be part of their saintly community, never be able to fit in. From a biblical perspective, slaveholders perceived Africans as cursed, referring to the curse of Ham, which is a Bible story in which Noah cursed his son Ham for allowing his son Canaan to see Noah naked and drunk. I never know that about Noah. For a reason no one knows, Christians began associating the curse of Ham with black-skinned people. They also perceived enslaved people as children needing guidance and direction with no will of their own, completely uneducated and illiterate. Many believed slavery was the natural state for these people. They never contemplated that the practice of slavery might actually induce that behavior, not be the reason for it. Finally, and most importantly, whites treated enslaved people as chattel or property. They had monetary value and were a taxable asset. In a pinch, a slaveholder could pay off his debts and fines by selling his enslaved people, even in death. Most bequeathed enslaved people to their heirs. Many elderly widows lived off the proceeds of their enslaved people, hiring them out to generate cash, a kind of colonial annuity. Unlike in the South, slaveholders in New England often worked side by side with the enslaved. Good workers were highly cherished and often given large degrees of professional and physical autonomy. Reverend James McSparran, a minister in Rhode Island with seven enslaved people, he genuinely lamented the death of his, quote, first, best, and most principal servant, Stepney. Other enslaved people became respected artisans and artists, such as Peter Fleet, an engraver in Boston, Prince Demo, who painted this portrait of Hingham resident Christian Barnes that now hangs in the Hingham Historical Society, and Phyllis Wheatley, a gifted poet who at the tender age of 18 had to prove her talent before the leading men of Boston, including John Hancock and Thomas Hutchinson. Why? Why did she have to prove herself? Well, no one at the time believed that a Black person could write such exquisite verse. By the way, she passed with flying colors. On the other hand, enslaved people in New England were chattel, as I said. They were bought, sold, bequeathed, whipped, punished, prohibited from attending school, and often treated as sexual property. When finally given freedom, many chose to leave the region. Now, remember the Reverend McSparran from the previous slide? After the death of his beloved Stepney, he promptly sold Stepney's son, Jr., not a wonderful way to commemorate his beloved slave. He also whipped Maroka for courting men and getting pregnant and sold her offspring. He also whipped another slave, Hannibal, and placed him in pothooks, as you can see here. And that's how a man of cloth treated his slaves in New England. Imagine what others did. Slaveholders viewed slaves as working assets. They valued hardworking enslaved people and punished slow or lazy ones. Pregnant slaves were a liability since they were less productive. Many slaveholders prevented their enslaved people from courting or marrying and sold their children as soon as possible, as I mentioned. However, sometimes slaveholders sold children to cover up the sexual impropriety of their sons, who often viewed female slaves as their own sexual property. Sadly, slaveholders freed their elderly slaves. Although sounds like a good thing, it wasn't. Many slaveholders simply wanted to dump these quote unquote unproductive assets. This became such a problem that many states required slaveholders to post a bond before freeing a servant in case that person could not support themselves. To the English colonists, slavery was a normal state of affairs. In the 18th century, people bought and sold slaves like we might hire a landscaping service today. But how did they rationalize such a monstrous evil? First, the Bible seemingly condoned it, at least some parts of it, like 1 Timothy, printed here. Other passages, like those in Exodus, condemned it. But people who want to rationalize an injustice aren't concerned with apparent inconsistencies. Second, slavery was common historically and globally. And England was not the first country, and Englishmen were not the first peoples to enslave people in the Western world. The Portuguese and Spanish beat them to it. Third, slavery fit nicely with the Puritan notion of patriarchy and the hierarchical order of things. As Cotton Mather wrote in 1698, quote, "There must be a superiority and an inferiority. There must be some who are to command, and there must be some who are to obey." At the same time, slavery made many New Englanders uncomfortable. First, it was odd to have strangers in their shining city of God, heathen among the saints. Second, periodic rebellions, murders, and thefts by enslaved people created an undercurrent of distrust and fear among white settlers. As more Africans came to New England, their presence and behavior became more concerning. Several colonies imposed curfews designed to control a growing and restive slave population, including Hingham, which imposed its own curfew on colored people in 1733. Now, here are the names of Hingham families that at some point in time owned enslaved people. The type size here refers to the number of times these families were referenced in primary source documents reviewed so far by members of the Historical Society here. As you can see, if Hingham wanted to expunge its slaveholding past, it would have to begin by renaming many of its streets and schools. When it first opened in 1681, the old ship meeting house reserved 12 spaces for Negro servants and men and boys, and also Indians. It's a quote. The new North Church, which opened in 1807, well after slavery was abolished here, reserved its uppermost galleries in the rear for African American servants. So those were the enslavers. Let's now turn our attention to the enslaved. Although their names and lives are mostly lost to history, we occasionally get a glimpse of them behind the statistics. In the early days, Native American women captured in quote unquote just wars were enslaved servants, while their husbands and fathers were shipped to the West Indies, where they faced that slow, inexorable death. Many natives rebelled or killed themselves rather than submit to white man's slavery. The Native Americans did not make great slaves. They were too rebellious. Carolina Indians were captured from Spanish missions. They already knew a trade and thus were highly prized, but they also were extremely rebellious. And most New England colonies prohibited their importation. Creoles were Africans born in the West Indies who could speak English. They were highly valued as well because they could quickly learn a trade or serve as middlemen between the slaveholder and the enslaved members of the household. For New Englanders, enslaved children were highly valuable because they were less expensive, for one, than adults, and two, could be taught English, and three, they could learn a skill. In essence, they were purchased as an investment and turned into apprentices, especially for tradesmen. Finally, African men far outnumbered enslaved African women, while Indian women far outnumbered Indian men who were shipped out. Thus, it was only a matter of time that a preponderance of African males married Native American women. And we see that in Hingham's record. Now, New Englanders practiced an interesting form of slavery known as household slavery. Unlike the American South, where enslaved people lived in separate quarters, in New England, enslaved people lived in the same house as their slaveholder, usually in attics or extended kitchens. They also generally ate the same food and wore the same clothes, although lower quality. But to be clear, although the enslaved were members of the household, they were not members of the family. Slaveholders often housed other non-family members besides enslaved people, including aunts, uncles, and widows, as well as indentured servants, students, paupers, and even orphans. In the 17th and 18th century, homes were truly multi-class, multiracial households, something that's hard to fathom today. In Hingham, General Benjamin Lincoln, our famous Revolutionary War hero, whose house the Historical Society is purchasing, owned several enslaved people. This is a picture of a room in the attic of that house that may have housed an enslaved person prior to 1780, or one or more freed Black servants after that time. The descendants of Benjamin Lincoln, who lived in this house until this year, referred to this room as Robert's room. Robert was presumably a live-in servant, although there is scant historical evidence about him. As I've mentioned, enslaved people in New England worked side by side with their white slaveholders in most professions. Females primarily worked inside the home, cooking, mending, spinning, and tending children, while males were butlers, carriage drivers, and stablemen serving the wealthy merchants and ministers. Otherwise, enslaved people worked in agriculture, shipping, and various industries doing the dirty, unsafe jobs most whites wouldn't do. Some became skilled artisans and artists, as we shall see. All right, so let's stop for a second, take another little quiz here, test your knowledge, this time about the legal rights of enslaved people in New England. Those rights differed slightly from their rights in the American South. So true or false, enslaved people could become church members. Well, that is true. They could own property. That is true. They could marry whites. No, definitely not. In fact, Massachusetts passed a anti-miscegenation law in 1705. They were whipped or sold if they couldn't pay fines. That is true. They could testify in court. That is true. They could file petitions in court. That is true. They had to right to life. In other words, if they were killed, the person who killed them would be punished. That also is true. They could serve in the militia. That is false, with a big asterisk next to it, because although whites did not want to arm enslaved people with weapons and train them, fearing an uprising, but in times of war, they are actually recruited in the French and Indian War and eventually in the Revolutionary War. But in peace times, in lieu of militia training, which is required of all adult males, they had to work on public properties like roads and public buildings. As the population of enslaved people grew in New England, there were more opportunities for them to socialize with each other. Most socializing happened at night. As Wendy Warren writes, 17th century New England was dark at night. But for captive people, night meant free time and unmonitored space, an invisible world of opportunity. Blacks gathered frequently in taverns or in private homes when slaveholders were gone. As you can imagine, these gatherings could become quite lively, a chance for enslaved people to forget their condition. One slaveholder whose slave had been missing for a few days found her in a nearby tavern with, quote, a dozen black gentry, he's and she's in a room in very merry humor, singing and dancing, having a violin, with a store of wine and punch. Church was another social outlet for enslaved people. Liberal ministers like Ebenezer Gay accepted Black congregants and even admitted them into the church. There were no Black churches in New England until after the Revolutionary War. Funerals were also a chance for Black people to congregate and mourn more than just the passing of a loved one. Wendy Warren writes, quote, "Black funerals were public spectacles. They were loud, boisterous, and disturbed the public peace. As a result, many cities, including Boston, restricted the activities of Black funerals." Another safe space was Negro Election Day, a day-long festivity with dancing, feasting, and parades that occurred on the same day as Colonial Election Day, when whites elected their public officers. In their version of Election Day, the Blacks were allowed to come together and elect a king or governor to represent them. These social spaces, few and far between, provide a much needed safety valve for an oppressed people living in a strange land. But for some enslaved people, these social spaces were not enough. Many ran away from vengeful masters, including Champagne, who ran away from Joshua Barker of Hingham. As this advertisement says, Champagne was about 35 years old, a slim, handsome-made fellow, about 5 feet 8 inches high. One of his ears had been bored for a jewel, and the hole broke out. He speaks good French. He carried with him a scarlet cloth turned up with yellow, a blue cloth coat, a silver laced hat, buff leather breeches with sundry other kind of clothing. So it appears that Champagne was quite the dandy, and it would have been very interesting to see him walking the streets of Hingham. Some of you may have seen this portrait by John Singleton Copley at the MFA. John Greenleaf Sr., not pictured here, was a Boston apothecary whose 2 infant children aged 11 and 15 months were poisoned by his enslaved servant Phyllis in 1751. At the time, Blacks thought that poisoning was a great way to enact revenge on their masters and their families, as well as fire. To deal with his grief, Greenleaf commissioned Copley to paint portraits of his deceased children. And this portrait is of John Jr., the infant son. So during the 18th century, there were several widely publicized cases of enslaved Blacks murdering their masters or family members. And these events caused great alarm among the slave-owning public. What about the enslaved in Hingham? Well, here's a sample list of enslaved people who lived in Hingham, whose lives were documented in records for baptism, marriage, death, or bills of sale. Some were Native Americans, most Africans. The baptisms, marriages, and deaths were recorded by Reverend Ebenezer Gay, who allowed Africans to partake of church sacraments at First Parish. Here are some more names, those we have found in military enlistments, tax lists, counting books, and wills, all Hingham residents. The Hingham Historical Society is pouring through documents like these to find out more about the lives of these little-known Hingham residents. Well, there are 2 residents that we know more about than others. One is Caesar Humphrey, and he was incredibly fortunate. His master, Joseph Humphrey, for reasons we do not know, freed him in 1766 in his will, in which he also gave him 11 acres of land near the present-day Ward Street, a horse, saddle, 3 steel traps, a wherry, and a yoke of oxen. We do not know what prompted this beneficence, but Caesar makes good on his fortune. He marries Candace, an Indian woman, and has 4 children. One, Caesar Jr., lives with his common-law wife, a white woman named Chloe Ward, presumably from the nearby Ward family. They tried to marry, but the marriage is crossed off on the records. I think someone realized they were running afoul of the anti-miscegenation laws. And their daughter marries James Tuttle, considered the founder of Tuttleville, a community of free Blacks in Hingham at the intersection of Ward and High Streets. Pompey Barnes was enslaved by Cornelius Barnes, but somehow gained his freedom. He worked as a day laborer and lived at 15 Ship Street for a while with his wife Phyllis, whom he married in 1760. By 1768, he owns a house, 2 cows, 6 sheep, 8 acres of pasture, 1 acre of tillage, 3 acres of mowing land, and 2 tons of fresh hay. Pompey died in 1798, and in 1810, his wife entered the Hingham almshouse. Like all people, if given enough opportunity and material resources, freed Blacks could establish stable families and communities. So we saw just 2 instances where enslaved people gained their freedom, but free men were the exception, not the rule, until after the Revolutionary War. What led to the emancipation of enslaved people in New England? Well, there were 4 main drivers, so let's go through each one. First, the rhetoric of the American independence movement in the 1760s and 70s awakened many people to the hypocrisy of slavery in their midst. Men like James Otis Jr., a Massachusetts advocate general, spoke forcefully for American freedom and man's inalienable rights, but he also voiced the hypocrisy of people demanding freedom for themselves while denying it to others in their midst. There were also a growing number of white abolitionists in the 18th century, people like Chief Justice Samuel Sewall, who we met earlier, who presided over the Salem witch trials, by the way. He wrote the first abolitionist tract in 1700, in which he used biblical stories like the selling of Joseph and passages from Exodus to discredit the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, his advocacy was roundly ignored. By the late 18th century, many Quakers, like Moses Brown, a former slave trader whose family founded Brown University in Providence, repudiated slavery and worked to abolish it, even as members of his own family continued in the slave trade. The Quakers were joined by some evangelical Christians, and their efforts gave birth to the abolitionist movement of the early 19th century. But free and enslaved Blacks became their own best advocates. Activists like Prince Hall from Massachusetts worked tirelessly for the freedom of enslaved people. He filed dozens of petitions to the Massachusetts legislature. He founded the first Freemasonry Society for African Americans and advocated for Black rights to an education and military service. Paul Cuffey, born on Cuttyhunk Island to a free Black man and an Indian woman, became a merchant and the wealthiest Black man in New England. Became politically active and, like Prince Hall, advocated for recolonizing free African Americans in Sierra Leone, a British colony established for that purpose. Free and enslaved Black men fought gallantly in the Revolutionary War, often side by side white soldiers. The Rhode Island 1st Regiment was an integrated unit that participated in the Siege of Yorktown, pictured here. George Washington, a slaveholder, finally improved the enlisting Black soldiers only after the British had done so, putting his forces at a numeric disadvantage. Perhaps the biggest reason why New England states abolished slavery is economic. We started with economics and we're ending with economics. After the war, there was a recession in which currency values plummeted, causing bankruptcies and land foreclosures that led to Shays' Rebellion in Western Massachusetts, if you remember that, which was put down by our very own General Benjamin Lincoln. He was the commander of the troops that quashed Shays' Rebellion. At the same time, the land gave out from over-farming, and this double whammy put thousands of people out of work and on the streets. These down-and-out white people became known as the strolling poor. In a fierce competition for jobs, they viewed the free labor provided by enslaved people as a violation of their rights. In 1795, John Adams, the only founding father who did not own slaves, by the way, was asked why slavery ended in New England, and he replied, quote, "Common people would not suffer the labor by which alone they could obtain a subsistence to be done by slaves. If slavery had not ended, the common white people would have put the Negroes to death and their masters too, perhaps." Contrary to popular opinion, slavery did not end immediately in New England, except in Massachusetts, where a successful lawsuit by an enslaved person named Quock Walker stated that slavery was incompatible with the new 1780 Constitution, written, by the way, by John Adams, that stated all men are born free and equal. That was a quote unquote time bomb that John Adams inserted into the Constitution, expecting that lawsuits would happen around it and force the end of slavery in Massachusetts. Even though Massachusetts never passed a law abolishing slavery, in 1783 ruling effectively freed enslaved people in Massachusetts. Other states enacted gradual emancipation laws. For instance, Connecticut passed a law in 1784 that newborns are free, but only once they reach the age of 25 for males and 21 for females. Their parents, however, unfortunately, were still enslaved for life. So why did states pass such gradual emancipation laws? First, the states said they had no money after the war to compensate slaveholders for their property or support freed Blacks who became paupers. Also, the states had just finished fighting a war to protect property rights. Ultimately, that's what the Revolutionary War was for. So abolishing slavery to many of them seemed incongruous. Now, with the passage of these laws, the number of enslaved people in New England gradually declined, but it still took more than a generation for slavery to disappear entirely from New England. Now, you might think that emancipation was a good thing for enslaved people, and on the whole it was, but there were severe repercussions. For one, slaveholders realized that they would lose a valuable asset. So they began selling their enslaved people out of state to loyalist friends in Canada or trading partners in the West Indies or the South. This became such a big problem that Rhode Island passed laws banning the practice. Seeing an opportunity also, many unscrupulous New Englanders kidnapped free Blacks and sold them into slavery. And Massachusetts passed a law in 1788 prohibiting that practice. Even worse, the strolling poor began latching onto a new perception of Blacks as biologically inferior. Before this time, Blacks were considered strangers, heathen, and cursed, but not biologically inferior to whites. This new virulent racism precipitated race riots and caused untold harm to free men, many of whom decided to leave the region to New York, Pennsylvania, Canada, and elsewhere. Even white abolitionists, starting with Samuel Sewall in 1700, all the way to Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, harbored racist perceptions of African Americans. Although they wanted to abolish slavery, they didn't think Africans were their equals or that they could effectively integrate into white society. Consequently, many white abolitionists and Black abolitionists too, like Prince Hall and Paul Cuffey that we talked about, pushed for recolonization efforts. Nonetheless, some freed Blacks stayed put. Many of Hingham's freed Blacks and Indians settled in Tuttleville, a small community at the intersection of Ward and High Streets. Many worked at a nearby shoe factory across the Weymouth line and other smaller work establishments. In 1873, residents there formed a church and community center, which still exists, but today it's a dentist office. So that was a whirlwind tour of slavery in New England and Hingham. Let me briefly summarize some of the main points. Slavery in New England, is about a pious people in pursuit of profit who embraced slavery. I don't know how to say it any other way. Also, New England was the engine of the slave trade. There's no getting around that. Slavery started early in New England, as we saw, and soon in the 18th century became very commonplace. Hingham had a larger than average enslaved population. Both Africans and Native Americans were enslaved. In New England, household slavery was the norm, where the enslaved worked side by side with whites. And finally, slavery gradually disappeared after the 1780s. So with that, I will turn this over to Eileen and Paula, and we will take your questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Wayne, and we will give you a more robust thank you as we get through some of the interesting questions that have come in. Some of the questions I'm going to direct to Paula because of her familiarity with some primary sources that you relied on that have been researched by a working group within the society. So a couple of questions about primary source materials. Let me get to them. Question one, other than inventories, day books, wills, and written communication, is there any physical evidence common to determine slave ownership in New England in the 18th century? Paula, would you like to comment on evidence of slave ownership, what the source material available is?
Sure, there are many of the types of documents that were on the slides that Wayne went through. Church records, government records. There were both colonial censuses and then, of course, when the United States was founded, there were our federal censuses. Tax lists and valuations. All of the town records, selectmen's records will occasionally show either hired out workers or other ways in which enslaved people would come to the notice of the town fathers. And family records, as the questioner said, account books, correspondence, probate records, probate inventories. It's really a process of looking carefully at all the documents you can find, which is why COVID-19 has been intensely frustrating to us, because so many of the libraries and archives and government offices that we would look for documents in are closed to us right now.
So a related question, Paul, I'll also direct to you. What records do we use to establish the number of slaves in a given year?
Well, I think that certainly the 1764 number that Wayne gave in that one slide was one of the years that there was a colonial census. There was 1764 and 1776 we have good numbers for, because they were years of a colonial census in Massachusetts. And then, as I said, on a town or granular level, it would be things like tax lists and tax valuations. I'm not sure where the larger regional numbers in Wayne's presentation came from.
And Wayne also accessed secondary sources. I know that Ben had relied on some different primary sources. A question that maybe deserves a little bit more clarification than you gave, Wayne. You talked about Vermont being actually it wasn't a colony at that time, it was its own republic, but the questioner said, didn't they abolish slavery in their constitution? The Constitution of the Republic did do something about slavery, but it was a gradual emancipation. Do you want to clarify how Vermont, you mentioned Connecticut details when you were on that slide. Do you recall?
It was pretty much the same as Connecticut. They were the first to abolish slavery in their constitution, and they were an independent republic for about 15 years. But they didn't immediately free them. They had to reach the age of 20 and 25 or something of that sort.
Right. Okay, so this is a meaty question. And I know you're not an economist by training, and it maybe requires kind of a macroeconomic view. How did Hingham or wider New England make the transition in its economy from a slave-based economy that one did not rely on this outsourced offshore slavery, and over what period of time did the economy adjust to not being based on slavery?
Well,
I know you didn't focus on that, but
yeah, well, first of all, it continued to subsist on slavery for many years into the 19th century, because even when the United States outlawed the slave trade, New England merchants still traded with, and England outlawed slavery and the slave trade too in the early 19th century, but the New England merchants still circumvented those laws and traded with Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch and other colonies that still had slavery. So they got around it. And there was quite an active, and then obviously the American South, right? So we continued to supply the South with, the same goods and materials that we supplied the West Indies to.
and obviously over time, Hingham specifically, the natural resources available, lumber specifically, dwindled over a period of decades. So our economy did shift to some other things, but it's a meaty question. I think probably would take a broader economic look to see gradually how our economy changed throughout New England.
Well,
I think
in the
one
early
other thing, I'm sorry, I was going to say to consider is that the labor question that Wayne referred to is so inextricably tied up with the sort of the economic depressions that the area and the country experienced post-Revolutionary War, that it's probably hard to separate out the part caused by the abolition of slavery and the loss of that labor in New England with all of the other disruptions that were going on.
So the other thing to remember is that the early 19th century, early 1800s was the start of the Industrial Revolution, which in many ways started right here in New England and Rhode Island with on the waterways, where people put up mills and started creating, textile factories. And Hingham had its factories, right? We had, and you know a lot about that, Eileen. So, fish was a huge export for Hingham in the 19th century. Buckets and barrels and things of that sort, and cloth, cord, rope. So we built a lot of industry in the 19th century. Maybe that's the next talk.
Yeah, it could be.
Industrial.
This question came in early, and I think you talked a bit about the churches and the fact that there were baptisms and marriages at First Parish, for example. The questioner said, did you know that William Shirley registered all of his slaves as members of King's Chapel in the 1740s? So it was a point of information, but if you want to elaborate on how churches treated enslaved people.
Yeah, Paula might want to contribute, but I think it varied. So Ebenezer Gay was pretty liberal, and he admitted blacks into the church as well as baptized them and married them. His successor, whose name eludes me, did not. There was no record of his successor doing anything of that sort. So I think it varied based on the minister himself.
So question about, you talked about one of the rights that slaves had in New England is that they could own property, but could they own land is the questioner's. That's the question that came in. Could they specifically own land?
That's a good question.
I think the answer is no from something I read, but I'm not an expert on it.
Certainly as free men, they could own land. We saw that with...
Yeah, it specifically asked about when they were still enslaved. They could own property, certainly, but personal property. I'm not sure.
I don't think I've seen any record of that happening. And Paul, I bet you haven't seen anything in the primary source documentation either.
Have not, and my general understanding is the same as the two of yours, that that New England slaves could own personal property, but not real property.
Okay. By the first federal census in Massachusetts, slavery was already illegal. Was there a colonial equivalent? I guess the question is, was there a colonial equivalent to the census? Well, we do have some census.
Yeah,
census records.
The general court ordered colonial censuses at, it's not regular 10-year periods like our federal censuses are. And it's interesting to see because in the 1790 census, the federal census has various different categories, one of which is slaves, because it's a federal form, but there are no slaves in the answers in the Massachusetts census. But the census otherwise was adult white males, minor white males, women, white women, and then all other free people. And so the people of color were all in the all other free people category in Massachusetts' 1790 census response.
But we don't know if early colonial records specifically
the
enumerated.
colonial census did count slaves, and that was, for instance, the 1764 figure that
Right.
Wayne cited for Hingham was from a colonial census.
Right, okay. So were slaves educated or allowed to read and write? For religious education in churches, where were they members? Well, you referenced First Parish. If they were not allowed to be educated or read and write, was it dangerous for Phyllis Wheatley to write? I think you have some knowledge of Phyllis Wheatley. Is such an interesting character and poet.
Yeah, no, the enslaved were not given an education. And that's one thing that some of the Black activists, argued for, getting Blacks general education. Some white slaveholders did take it upon themselves to educate their enslaved people, like Phyllis Wheatley, who ended up becoming quite a intelligent, articulate poet. So, but that was much the exception rather than the rule.
Wasn't there a story about, was it the legislature, someone asking Phyllis Wheatley to respond to questions because they were so shocked that she was writing this poetry?
Yeah, no, I mentioned that she was brought before the top leaders of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson and John Hancock, and was basically told to, demonstrate that she could write poetry, as people had claimed, and she did.
Henry Louis Gates wrote a book about that. That's a very short book and a good read.
And who was that, Paul?
Henry Louis Gates.
Right. Okay. So this is a question about our ministers in town. So you mentioned that Reverend Gay owned slaves and also made a mention of Reverend Daniel Shute. So the questioner is asking what records is that based on, and what do we know about any Shute slaves? Paula, maybe you can respond to that one.
I think what we know is that there were African-American residents of Hingham in the late 18th, early 19th century with the surname Shute, particularly Prince Shute and Pat Shute, his wife, who we have their baptism, marriage records, and they entered the almshouse in Hingham in the early 19th century. I think the supposition comes from the fact that the only white Shutes that appear in the Hingham records for the 1790 and 1800 censuses are the Reverend Daniel Shute and his son.
This question, not sure we have an exact answer. Are there any remaining descendants of the original enslaved families who lived in Hingham? So any remaining descendants locally, I guess, is the question. I know there are descendants of the Tuttle family broadly on Ward Street, but we don't know if their ancestors were ever enslaved. We know of the free Black Tuttles. I don't know if we ever have specific evidence that those Tuttles had at one point included a slave. So Paul, I don't know if to your knowledge, are there any descendants of the original enslaved families living in the area or in Hingham?
Well, for instance, as Wayne mentioned, one of the daughters of Caesar Humphrey, who was a gentleman who was freed, I think, in 1760, so was a former slave, and one of his daughters married one of the Tuttles. And I think that there are also, similar examples. So I guess it sort of depends how you define it. But yes, I think there are likely people in town who descend from slavery.
Okay. So this is, let me just read this question, it's longish. I think the decline in trade with the South coincided with the decline of the fishing industry by the end of the 1880s, which coincided with the end of the shipbuilding industry. Indentured servants who were brought up with ship owners on their trips back from the South could own land in New England, which was different than in the South. This was addressed in that other book by Hardesty. So if you want to comment on that, this is a point of information. Another book by Hardesty talks about treatment of indentured slaves being brought back up from the South. Anything in that comment that you want to add to?
You say 1880s or
This
17?
is what the questioner is saying. I think the decline in trade with the South coincided with the decline of the fishing industry by the end of the 1880s, which coincided with the end of the shipbuilding industry. Certainly in Hingham, there was a tie between the mackerel fishing industry and shipbuilding. Shipbuilding was never huge, but it was supportive of the mackerel industry, which was tied to the West Indies. Then it says indentured servants who were brought up with ship owners on their trips back from the South could own land in New England. So the indentured servants could own land.
Well, indentured
It's two different comments perhaps by the commenter, because I don't think there was either indentured servitude or slavery in the 1880s.
So it's a, yeah, it's a, I guess it was meant as a point of information, but it's a little confusing to track it.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just see. Oh, we have a huzzah from a listener.
Love those.
For your awesome job in compiling this information, putting it together in a cohesive narrative. Okay, another question. Do you have any more information about the marriages between the Black and Indigenous people, the natives here in Hingham? Certainly there were Native Americans who married Tuttles. I know any specific information, Paula, that you have about
I can only comment on the micro level. Certainly, the ministers, Ebenezer Gay, Daniel Shute, Henry Ware, would indicate in the records the race of the people they were marrying, if it was other than white. And so there are a significant number of marriage records that is, so and so and so and so, and indicating, as Wayne said, most often a Black man and an Indigenous woman.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a, let me see, where did it go? Someone asked if there had ever been conversation about renaming any streets, for example, in Hingham or in the area that were associated with slave owners. This is obviously a question that's being asked all over the country when it comes to association. The Faneuil Hall example is a good one. I think the picture that Wayne painted of the widespread nature of merchants in particular, and then other well-off families in Hingham owning slaves, there are quite a number of streets that would be involved. One point I'd like to make, and then I'll throw it out to Wayne and Paula, because certainly it's a thought-provoking question worthy of discussion. There are families who over time evolved in how they thought about slavery and whether they thought slavery should be abolished. And there are examples of those in the names that Wayne mentioned, of who in later generations were leading abolitionists. And so it's a complicated question. But Paula and Wayne, anything you want to add to the idea of, the question was, has there ever been a movement to rename anything locally because of association with slavery?
I'm not aware of any.
Maybe after today.
And I think one of the things that comes up is understanding that it's important to know about our past, the community, whether we've lived here all our lives or not, to realize that all 13 colonies had slaves, to understand how the economy was so tied, even if people didn't have their own household slaves, that often what they were doing was tied in some way to slavery in the West Indies. It was a widespread economic foundation of life that, as you were pointing out, Wayne, when sugar took off in Barbados, it was considered heaven sent by the Puritans of New England. So I think, it's something we have to think about. It's important for us to know about this, to learn from it, and not whitewash it. So that's something that we'd have to think about if anything were to be discussed about renaming something. Let's see, anything else? I think we have covered a nice range of questions. Thank you to the audience. This question about sharing information, I just wanted everyone to know that this presentation, after we review the recording, make sure there's no technical difficulties, we will be making available to all of those who were ticketed holders for this lecture. And I know some people were unable to attend the lecture today on Zoom and will be able to see the recording. We usually get the link to the recording out within about 5 days of the lecture, so stay tuned for that. And let's see. Okay, I think we've done a good job on the questions. So let me, first of all, thank Wayne. Paula talked about this tradition of the Hingham Historical Society supporting individuals, either members of the society or residents with an interesting question to pursue in their research. In this case, I just want to admit that we approached Wayne. We knew of his interest in history as an avocation. We also know he is a busy professional, and to his credit, Wayne took this on when approached by members of the Education Committee, and we thank him profusely for the diligence with which he worked. I know he worked also with a number of people like Paula, Ellen Miller, and others who've gathered some of the primary source information for Hingham specifically. So there was some collaboration involved, but this was an awesome labor and a terrific product that you've produced. And it is just the beginning of work that is ongoing. So I'll touch on that in a second. So first of all, thank you, Wayne. Couple of announcements before we close. First of all, if you have a subscription to the full lecture series, you would recently have received a link to a virtual walking tour of the Benjamin Lincoln neighborhood. And we just want to remind you to take advantage of that. If we still have some nice days before winter takes hold, you may want to use that as a basis of taking your own self-guided walk around that neighborhood. But there's much you can learn just from looking at the virtual tour. So enjoy that. Second, our next live via Zoom lecture in this series will be in January, on Sunday, January 17th. And the topic is Education in Colonial New England, Schooling in a Changing World. Based on what I've already heard from Andy Hertig, who's researching this topic, it should be quite fascinating and interestingly quite relevant to today, where the role of education and the shifting that is going on because of COVID, the role of parents versus teachers and formal schools, it will sound very fresh, I think, when you hear what Andy's putting together. So Andy Hertig is the retired dean of faculty and the chair, and was chair of the history department at Phillips Exeter Academy. So he has great grounding in history, and we look forward to that lecture again, Sunday, January 17th. For those of you who don't have a subscription and want to buy a ticket, we do have individual ticketing available for that event. So we encourage you to go to hinghamhistorical.org to get a ticket for that lecture. And finally, for those of you who would enjoy, once again, joining us for a post-program visit with other audience members, you should have received, while this program was going on, an invitation to a separate Zoom where you can see and hear each other talk about the conversation that we just had with Wayne, the information that he has shared, and anything else that you want to talk about with members of the Education Committee about what's forthcoming, that would all be possible within that Zoom. So we look forward to seeing you there. And with that, I thank you all. Thanks to Paula as well as Wayne for your answering all these questions. And Wayne, once again, a big round of applause for you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.